A battle over the question of local control versus federal power is playing out in the western U.S. once again. And this time it involves a prized Native American archaeological site. It's happening in Utah, where federal prosecutors filed criminal charges of conspiracy yesterday against 5 men who organized an illegal all-terrain vehicle ride into a canyon closed to motorized vehicles. 7 years ago, federal land managers closed the canyon to ATVs and the like to protect it. Since that time, the dispute has come to stand for a much larger fight. Jeffrey Brown visited the canyon and the protest organizers for his series, Culture at Risk.
It's called Recapture Canyon, 28 miles of rocky cliffs, juniper trees, and wildlife in southeast Utah. And for hundreds of years, beginning around 500 AD, it was home to a large Native American Pueblo population.
So how many people would have lived in a place like this?
In a structure like this, you would have probably had an extended family, 10, 12, maybe up to 15 people.
Utah archaeologist Jody Patterson brought us on a mile-long hike into Recapture to see the remains of one of its many cliff dwellings.
It's a little like an apartment complex built into the rock here.
That's exactly what this is. Yeah. We got enough rooms for living, for cooking, for sleeping, and of course some activity areas too for doing some other things out in front.
For archaeologists and history buffs, Recapture Canyon is a gold mine, one that requires careful preservation.
We need to understand the impacts that are going to be happening to sites like this throughout the canyon before we open it up and just let everybody come in.
And 7 years ago, the Federal Bureau of Land Management agreed. Megan Crandall is a BLM spokeswoman.
In 2007, we decided to close the canyon because of the amazing cultural and archaeological resources that are here. We needed to protect them from the degradation that can occur when you're using the area with motorized recreation.
But the years of closure have angered many. Earlier this summer, local residents, all-terrain vehicle enthusiasts, and states' rights advocates came to Recapture to protest what they see as a blatant abuse of power by the federal government. Hundreds showed up, some riding illegally into the canyon. John Felmuth attended the Recapture protest, though he rode no further than the canyon closure.
It just seems like ATV use, which we view as a perfectly legitimate, is oftentimes cast as an inappropriate and damaging use of the outdoors, the federal lands. It's simply not the case.
Last May's demonstration in Recapture came only weeks after the showdown in Nevada between the well-armed rancher Cliven Bundy and the BLM over unpaid grazing fees. So tensions throughout the West were high.
There's something magical about it.
San Juan County Commissioner Phil Lyman was the man who organized the Recapture protest. Walking along the cliffs above the canyon, Lyman says he too has a sense of history and love for this place.
You know, that's been there for 800 years.
Lyman, who lives in nearby Blanding, comes from a long line of Mormon settlers who founded towns across the state.
To those of us who live here, and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were involved in building those roads, you can't just erase a town's history that way.
For Lyman, this dispute is about how much say local governments have over federal land decisions. It's a major issue in a state where the federal government owns 2/3 of all land.
It was the BLM's disregard for local interests, local culture, the local people, the people who live here and have lived here for a long, long time. That's why I say it was not about recapture, it was not about ATVs. It was trying to get a message through that there are actually people here. We have the same rights to exist in this area that you have the rights to exist, you know, in Washington, D.C. or wherever you come from.
He says local officials should have the right to decide how to use what he sees as a well-established pathway. And he's angered by the length of time this has all taken, 7 years in running.
Now, is this the same age as this one?
In response, BLM spokeswoman Megan Crandall told us that determining environmental and other impacts is a complicated process.
We have a responsibility to look at things like water, look at wildlife, look at plant resources, soil resources. The whole thing creates a holistic picture, and that takes time.
Well, one of the things we hear from people is just this frustration with process, heavy-handedness, lack of
engagement?
Well, first of all, I have to say BLM Utah is not heavy-handed. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that here in San Juan County on BLM lands, there's 2,800 miles of trail that are open to motorized recreation, which is about the distance between New York and LA. That's a lot of trail.
Crandall also points out that Recapture Canyon is still open to non-motorized travel, hikers and horseback riders.
What's odd about this
For Phil Lyman, that's not the point.
It's just rolling over the top of communities. And you know, this resonates with other rural Western communities because they've seen it themselves. They're dealing with the BLM.
So one of you will run a tape.
200 miles to the north in Utah's 9 Mile Canyon, Jerry Spangler agrees there's something bigger going on, even if he disagrees with Lyman about everything else.
Right now the main task is to get this large residential feature documented and get the rock art documented and the relationship of any artifacts to those two features, okay?
Spangler is an archaeologist working to preserve sites throughout Utah, including thousands of petroglyphs like the Great Hunter Panel. He sees a variety of potential threats, from well-organized oil and gas exploration to random vandalism.
I use the example all the time that archaeological sites are like books. And that book will tell you a complete story about the people who lived there. But once you start denigrating the site, you're just ripping out pages out of that book. And you rip out enough pages, pretty soon the story doesn't make any sense. We want to keep the book together. We've got a library of books that can tell us a very rich story about people who lived 1,000 years ago.
Meanwhile, San Juan County commissioners, including Phil Lyman, recently voted to bring a lawsuit against the BLM to force a decision on motorized vehicles in Recapture Canyon.
Jeff has more on our website about archaeological sites at risk in Utah. Tomorrow night, he'll have a second story about a very different kind of dispute over land use in the West: extreme sports.